They left her to die in the snow, betrayed, alone, and broken. But what they didn't expect was for her to rise again and lead a quiet revolution that would bring a corrupt empire to its knees. This is a story of survival, justice, and the unstoppable power of truth. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We'd love to know. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next unforgettable story. I didn't scream when they dragged me from my cabin. There was no one to hear it anyway, just the wind, sharp and howling, like it already knew what they were about to do. They came at night, 4 of them, faces wrapped in scarves, eyes full of something colder than the snow that blanketed the hills. I knew who they were, even if they didn't say a word. Reverend Dalton didn't need to speak. He'd already said everything in his sermons, about prideful widows, about obedience, about what happens to women who defy God's order. I had defied him. I'd refused his brother's proposal, and for that I was no longer welcome. They didn't strike me, not with fists. Their violence was quieter, more permanent. One of them grabbed my journal, another took the quilt I'd kept since John died. When they shoved me into the wagon, I didn't resist. What was the point? My neighbors, the people who had brought me bread when John passed, had turned their backs. Even Martha Dalton, who once held my hand during prayer, avoided my eyes when I pleaded with her from the porch. We rode in silence for what felt like hours, deeper into the wilderness than I'd ever dared venture alone. The moon hung low over Thunder Hollow, casting everything in silver light. That's where they left me. No farewell, no scripture, my wedding ring, and the empty stretch of snow ahead. They didn't even pretend I might find my way back. I was a message to others now, a warning. When the wagon turned around and disappeared into the trees, I didn't move. My legs had already begun to numb, and my thoughts floated like mist in the cold. I walked for a while. Hours, maybe. I don't remember. Time gets strange when you're dying. The cold was everywhere, in my bones, in my breath. The wind tore at my hair and whispered John's name like a cruel joke. My boots sank deep into my fingers, raw and bleeding. I tried to light a fire with torn pages from my journal, stories I'd written to keep myself sane after John's death. But the wind stole every spark before it caught. Eventually, I fell. My knees hit the snow hard. I stayed down, watching the sky flicker behind clouds. My wedding ring glinted faintly, the last piece of gold I had. "I tried, John," I whispered. My voice cracked and vanished into the cold. I really did. I remembered his fever, how I held his hand for 3 days and nights as his life slipped away. I remembered how warm his skin had been, even at the end. I'd buried him behind our cabin with the wildflowers he used to pick for me. And now, I'd die alone in the snow, with no one to mark the spot but the wind and the crows. My vision blurred. I felt warm. That's how you know it's almost over. Your body stops fighting. I thought I saw light, then a shadow. A large one. A horse? I wasn't sure. My thoughts slowed, tangled. My last memory was of strong arms lifting me, a voice I couldn't understand, and the soft creak of leather as the world finally went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I know I didn't expect to wake up. When the warmth returned, it came as a slow burn, first in my chest, then in my hands, like fire stoked in a long-dead hearth. I heard murmured voices, the sound of water boiling, the rough scrape of boots on wooden floors. The air smelled of pine smoke, wool, and something clean. Soap, maybe. I drifted in and out, dreaming of things that weren't real. John reading poetry by lamplight, my mother's voice humming lullabies, the touch of a warm hand brushing hair from my forehead. But something was real. That warmth, that voice, that hand. I opened my eyes once and saw a face I didn't know, gruff, weather-worn, but kind. He was talking softly, though I couldn't understand the words. I wanted to speak, to ask where I was, who he was, why I was still breathing. But I slipped back into the dark again before I could form the words. Later, days later maybe, I would learn his name was Grant Callahan, that he was the richest rancher in the territory, that he rarely left the southern trails, that his horse had led him off course that day and he'd followed instinct into the frozen mouth of Thunder Hollow, that he'd found me just minutes from death and carried me back to his ranch through the blizzard, wrapped in his own coat. But I didn't know any of that then. All I knew was that for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I was safe. I was alive. And someone had cared enough to make it so. They had meant to bury me. But somehow I'd been found, and nothing would ever be the same. The first time I saw the inside of the Callahan Ranch, I wasn't awake enough to remember it. I only know what I was told afterward, that I was half frozen, skin like paper, lips turning blue, and bones so brittle with cold they feared I might break apart. They said I weighed nothing, like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. It was Beatrice Monroe who pulled me back to the land of the living. A sturdy woman in her late 60s with sharp gray eyes and a mouth that rarely wasted words. She'd been Grant's housekeeper for 20 years, but more than that, she was the one soul on earth he listened to without question. I would later come to learn that if Beatrice prayed over you, death had no choice but to back away. I don't remember much from those first days. There were flickers, soft cloth on my forehead, the warm heaviness of blankets layered over me like armor, the smell of chicken broth and pinewood smoke. I remember the feel of a hand in mine, large and calloused, as if it belonged to someone who worked hard but held gently. That was Grant. I didn't know it yet, but I'd recognize that grip anywhere. When I finally opened my eyes, it was night. The fire was low, casting shadows that danced across thick log walls. I was in a room unlike any I'd seen, rugged but beautiful. The bed was piled high with quilts, and a large window overlooked a field blanketed in snow. I blinked, unsure if I was still dreaming. "Welcome back." The voice startled me. It came from the chair beside the bed, where a man sat holding a steaming mug. His eyes were dark, tired, but warm in a way that made me want to trust him, though I'd learned better than to trust easily. "You're safe now," he said, not moving. "You're at Callahan Ranch. I'm Grant." His voice was low and steady, the kind you'd want reading to you during a storm. I didn't speak. My throat felt like it was full of sand. Grant reached for a tin cup on the nightstand and held it out, not pressing, just offering. I took it with trembling hands and drank. The water was cool and tasted like it came straight from a mountain spring. It slipped down my throat like a blessing. "You were close," he said. "Another hour and—" He didn't finish the thought, just looked into the fire. I managed a whisper. "Why'd you help me?" His brow furrowed, like the question confused him. "Because you were there," he said. "Because someone had to." That answer shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. It meant everything. No one had said that to me in a long, long time. He stood then, slow and careful, like he didn't want to spook me. "Beatrice will be back soon. She'll get you settled. I'll be nearby if you need anything." I watched him walk out the door, broad-shouldered, confident, but quiet in a way that told me he was used to being alone. Beatrice came in minutes later, arms full of fresh blankets and a determined look on her face. "Well, you're alive," she said, setting down the stack. "That's a start." Her hands were brisk and competent as she checked my pulse, adjusted the pillows, and muttered about stubborn men who rode into snowstorms. But when she looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze softened. "They did this to you?" she asked. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. She pressed her lips into a tight line and said, "Then they're going to regret it." The next few days blurred together. I drifted in and out of sleep, sometimes waking to Beatrice reading psalms in a voice that trembled just slightly, or to Grant speaking softly to his ranch hands outside the window. The men's boots crunched through the snow. Horses whinnied in the distance. The world kept turning, even while I lay in that bed, trying to remember how to be a person again. At night, I'd hear the wind scratch against the windows like it wanted to remind me where I'd come from. But then Beatrice would come in, stoke the fire, and hum an old hymn under her breath that chased the shadows away. I hadn't realized how much I missed the sound of a human voice that didn't come with judgment. One morning, I awoke to sunshine bleeding through the window. The storm had passed. I could see the snow-covered hills rolling into the horizon, and for the first time, I didn't feel like they were trying to bury me. I tried to sit up too fast and let out a gasp as pain ripped through my ribs. The door opened instantly. Grant stepped inside, eyebrows raised. "Easy now." "I'm fine," I lied, breathless. He tilted his head. "You've got that widow grit," he said, half smiling. "But that doesn't mean you need to pretend you're made of iron." I looked away. Old habit. He didn't press. Instead, he stepped aside to let Beatrice in with a bowl of stew that smelled like heaven. "You eat, you rest, and maybe later you tell us who to punch," she said, matter of fact. I almost laughed. Almost. Later that afternoon, I asked Grant a question I'd been holding in since I woke. Why were you in Thunder Hollow? He paused, then sat in the chair beside the bed. Truth? I don't usually go that way, but my horse Shadow wouldn't stay on the main trail. Kept pulling north, like he knew something I didn't. He glanced out the window. I guess he did. I looked at him then, really looked. His beard was rough, and his hands were stained from years of work, but there was something noble in the way he carried himself, like a man who'd made peace with the land and his place in it. I owe you my life, I said quietly. He met my eyes. You don't owe me a thing, but I get the feeling you've got a story worth telling. My throat tightened. Not yet. I wasn't ready to say it out loud, but something told me he'd wait. That night I lay awake long after the fire had died down. My body still hurt, and my heart ached in ways I didn't have words for. But the wind had changed, and for the first time since John died, I didn't feel like I was disappearing. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what Reverend Dalton and his flock would do when they found out I was still breathing. But I knew this. Grant Callahan had seen a stranger lying half dead in the snow, and instead of turning away, he picked her up. Maybe the world wasn't as lost as I thought. Maybe I wasn't either. By the 5th day, the color had returned to my hands. I still moved like something mended and fragile, but the heat in my chest no longer felt borrowed. Beatrice let me shuffle to the armchair by the fireplace, wrapped in layers like a child, with hot tea balanced carefully in my lap. She made it with wild mint and honey, and though she claimed she wasn't one for fuss, I'd caught her praying over it the night before. Grant stopped by the sitting room that afternoon. He didn't knock, just leaned in with a slight nod and said, "You feel like telling me who tried to bury you yet?" I hesitated, not because I didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real. He waited, didn't rush me. There was a gentleness in him I hadn't expected from a man with dirt-stained boots and a gun belt resting on his hip. I took a breath. "It was Reverend Dalton," I said, voice brittle, "and the men who follow him." Beatrice, who had been knitting nearby, paused mid-stitch. "Dalton?" Grant repeated. "From the Ridge Settlement?" I nodded. "He's not a reverend in the way you might think. He wears the collar, quotes the scriptures, but his gospel's made of power and fear. He calls women like me unruly, says we need correcting." "Women like you?" Grant asked. "Widows who won't remarry," I said flatly, "especially when they say no to men like his brother." Beatrice muttered something under her breath that I didn't quite catch, though it didn't sound charitable. I kept talking, faster now, as if the words were burning holes in my throat. After John passed, they let me be for a while. But then Simon Dalton came around, said I should marry him, that it was the Lord's will. I said no. The bruises on his first wife never healed before she died. Consumption, they claimed, but I saw the truth in her eyes long before the coughing began. "They didn't take rejection kindly, I take it," Grant said, his jaw tense. "They said I was prideful, said I thought myself better than the community, that I was refusing God's plan. Then one night, they came, took me from my home, loaded me into a wagon. I didn't even have shoes on." Beatrice set her knitting aside and walked out of the room. I heard cupboards opening in the kitchen, jars clinking. When she returned, she placed something gently on my lap, a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a slice of cornbread and a small folded note. "You're safe here," she said softly. "But we won't let them get away with it." Grant knelt beside the chair. "What else did they leave behind?" I swallowed. "My journal. It was half torn apart. I'd written everything. What I saw, what I knew. I tried to burn the pages to keep warm, but the wind wouldn't let them catch fire." He stood and walked over to a side table, pulling open a drawer. From it, he retrieved a small bundle of water-stained pages, folded and curled with age and weather. "These them?" he asked. I gasped. "Where did you?" "Found them near where I found you," he said. "Scattered across the snow, thought they might be yours." I reached for them with trembling hands, the ink mostly blurred, but some of my handwriting still visible. The curve of my L's, the shaky S's. It felt like holding a piece of my own soul. Grant crossed his arms and leaned against the wall, watching me read the fragments. "They didn't just want to get rid of you," he said. "They wanted to erase you." "That's what he does," I whispered. "Dalton doesn't just banish people. He rewrites the story afterward, and the others, they follow along. Too scared not to. He nodded slowly. Then we tell the truth louder than he can lie. I looked up, startled by the conviction in his voice. I'm not just a man with cattle and fences, Eliza, he said. My father built this ranch on the back of his own blood, and he taught me something before he died. You stand up for people who don't have anyone left. That's the only kind of wealth that means anything out here. A knock came at the door. Jenkins, the foreman, stepped in, brushing snow from his coat. His expression was pinched, eyes wary. Grant, he said, we've got trouble. Letter nailed to the front gate. One of Dalton's boys must have snuck out here last night. Grant took the paper, unfolding it without a word. I could see the thick cream stock even from the chair. Expensive, embossed with gold script. He read it silently, then passed it to me. My hands trembled as I took it. The Lord does not look kindly on those who harbor the prideful. Return what was rightfully cast out, or suffer the consequences of divine justice. The ink was dry, but the venom bled through every word. Grant's voice was tight. They're trying to scare us into handing you over. I stared at the letter, bile rising in my throat. This is how it starts. Threats, then fires, then worse. Grant turned to Jenkins. Double the patrols. No one rides alone. Check the barns. Watch the perimeter. I want armed eyes on every fence line. Jenkins gave a sharp nod and disappeared. You're not going anywhere, Grant said firmly. But they'll come. Then let them. This land is mine, not theirs, and I don't answer to men who use scripture as a weapon. My heart thudded in my chest. No one had stood up for me like this. Not since John, and even then, not like this. Not with rifles being loaded outside and boots stomping through snow. Beatrice came back into the room with a pistol tucked in her apron and a rolled-up quilt under her arm. I've seen men like Dalton before, she said. They hide behind pulpits because they're cowards in daylight, but they can't hide from the truth forever. She handed me the quilt. It's my mother's. Came with us from Virginia. You wrap yourself in that tonight, and you remember, you're not alone anymore. I wanted to thank her, but all that came out was a whisper. What if they come for everyone? What if this place burns because of me? Grant knelt again, his voice low but fierce. You didn't bring fire here, Eliza. They did, but we're not kindling. We're stone, and if they try to strike us, well, they'll learn what happens when the wind blows back in their faces. I looked at the journal pages in my lap. Torn, soaked, fragile, but still here, just like me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the fire long after Beatrice retired to her room and the ranch settled into quiet. Grant had left a lantern burning outside, casting a soft glow across the snow-draped porch. I stared at it through the window, heart heavy, nerves wired. They knew I was alive, and they weren't done with me. But they didn't know who they were dealing with anymore. I was no longer the widow who begged to be left alone. I had a voice. I had truth. And this time, I had people who would stand beside me. The morning after that letter arrived, the ranch no longer felt like a quiet refuge. It felt like a sleeping giant preparing to rise. By dawn, men were already out checking the fence lines, rifles slung across their backs. Jenkins barked orders with a kind of energy I hadn't seen before. Horses were saddled, supplies gathered, and a second pot of coffee brewed before the sun had even cleared the ridge. From the window of the sitting room, I watched them move with precision, each motion practiced, like this wasn't their first time preparing for a fight. And maybe it wasn't. Life on the frontier had a way of hardening people, but there was something different in the air now. It wasn't just preparation, it was loyalty. Grant came in from the cold, cheeks ruddy and breath curling in the air as he stomped snow from his boots. I want you to stay close to the house today, he said, not as a command but as a plea. I was already wrapped in a shawl, seated by the hearth with Beatrice's quilt over my knees. You think they'll try something soon? He nodded, eyes dark with calculation. Dalton's boys never send a warning without a follow-up. It's just a matter of when and how. My pulse quickened. Maybe I should go, I said quietly. If I leave now? No. He cut me off, crossing the room to crouch beside me. You're not the problem, Eliza. They are. You leaving won't stop them. They've been looking for a reason to tighten their grip on this region for years. If it hadn't been you, it'd be someone else. His voice was low, steady, the voice of a man used to managing cattle, storms, and men with guns. And now, apparently, women like me who didn't know whether to run or fight. "I don't want anyone getting hurt for me," I whispered. "You're not the first person they've tried to silence," he said. "But you can be the first they fail to." That silenced me. He stood and reached for his coat, slinging it back on with practiced ease. "I'll be around, and Jenkins has eyes everywhere. If they try to sneak in, we'll know." After he left, Beatrice brought me a cup of coffee and sat down with her knitting. She worked in silence for a while before glancing at me over the top of her glasses. "Man's right, you know." I looked at her. "About you staying. About you being worth fighting for." "I don't feel worth much right now," I admitted. "You're alive," she said. "You made it out of that hollow when they meant you not to. That alone makes you dangerous to men like Dalton." She said it like it was a good thing. Later that morning, I wandered into the kitchen. It had become my haven over the past few days, a place where the scent of cinnamon and simmering stew made the world outside seem manageable. I tied on an apron and started kneading bread, more forcefully than usual. Beatrice didn't stop me. "You bake like you're trying to fight someone," she remarked mildly. "Maybe I am." By noon, I'd filled the air with the smell of fresh bread and something called peace pie, Beatrice's idea of comfort food with a crust so flaky it could make a grown man cry. It wasn't much, but it gave me purpose. The men came in shifts to eat, their boots muddy, faces drawn. Most didn't say much, but a few offered shy nods, respectful glances. They knew who I was now, and not one of them looked at me with pity. That evening, Grant and I walked the fence line near the western ridge. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the twisted remains of a post that had been deliberately smashed. Grant crouched beside it, fingers tracing a crude cross carved deep into the splintered wood. "They're sending messages," he muttered. I stood a few paces behind, arms crossed tight against the chill. What kind of men believe they speak for God while breaking their neighbors' fences? He rose, brushing his hands on his jeans, the kind who confuse power with righteousness. He turned to me. "I'm sorry, Eliza." "For what?" "For what you've lived through, for what's still coming." I shook my head. "Don't be. I'm not the same woman they left in that snow." He gave me a long look, something unspoken passing between us. As we walked back, the ranch lit up with lanterns and voices calling in the cold. One of the younger ranch hands ran up with news. Riders had been spotted on the ridge, watching. "Just watching," he repeated nervously. "Didn't come close." Grant sent 2 men out to shadow them, then turned to me. "It's starting." That night, the main room of the ranch house filled with people. Grant's hands, a few neighbors who'd gotten wind of the trouble, and Beatrice, who armed every man with a full plate and a second helping. I stayed in the back, but I listened. "They said they'd come for her," Jenkins said. 3 days. "That was 2 days ago," another voice replied. "They think this is just a ranch," someone else muttered. "They don't realize it's a line in the sand." I watched Grant standing near the fire, his back straight, his voice steady as he laid out patrols and fallback points. "We're not looking for blood," he said. "But we won't be pushed. If they ride here, they ride into consequences." And every man there nodded. I slipped out after that. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but with something fiercer. Rage, maybe. Or resolve. The next morning I found myself walking into the barn with a rifle in my hands. Grant saw me before I saw him. He was brushing down Shadow, his black stallion, and glanced up with a half smile. "You planning to shoot anyone today?" "Not unless they ask for it," I replied. He stepped forward, gently took the rifle, checked the barrel, and handed it back. "You ever fired one?" "Once. John taught me, said it was important for a woman to know how." Grant nodded. "Smart man." He set a target outside, walked me through my stance, my grip, my breath. I hit wide, then wide again, but on the 3rd shot I caught the edge of the target. "That's our girl," Jenkins called from nearby. I lowered the gun, breath trembling. That felt good. "That's because you're not helpless anymore," Grant said. I met his eyes. "No," I said, "I'm not." By nightfall the ranch was ready. The lamps were dimmed, the rifles were loaded, and every soul within these walls knew what they were willing to defend. Not just a woman, but the right for that woman to say no. The right to live. The right to survive without chains. And as I sat by the fire that night, Grant's voice echoed in my mind. "You can be the first they failed to silence." Tomorrow, I planned to prove him right. They came just after sunset. It was the kind of evening that starts quiet, too quiet. No owls, no wind, not even the usual murmurs from the stables. The kind of stillness that settles over the land like a held breath. Beatrice noticed it first. She stepped onto the porch with a shotgun cradled in her arms and squinted into the darkness like she could smell danger on the air. Grant was already outside, his coat dusted with frost, eyes sharp. "Get inside," he said to me, calm but firm. "I'm not hiding." "You're not," he said. "You're watching from the window, just like we planned. Jenkins is up on the ridge with 2 others. If they try to circle the barn, we'll see it." From the front window, I counted the flickers of torchlight in the distance. First 3, then 5, then more. Horses snorted, hooves crunched. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the silhouette of a man riding out ahead of the others, high in the saddle like he believed God himself had handed him authority. Reverend Dalton. Even from 100 yards, I knew that self-righteous posture. I knew the glint of the cross hanging from his neck, big as a badge, catching firelight like a weapon. He raised his voice. "Grant Callahan, you are harboring a woman condemned by the will of the Lord. Return her, and we will leave in peace." Grant didn't flinch. He stood in the center of the yard, one hand resting on the butt of his holstered revolver. "This is Callahan land," he called back. "And there's no condemnation here except the kind that rides with you." The torches swayed. I could see the other riders now, nearly 20 men, armed, tense. Some of them I recognized from the settlement. Farmers, blacksmiths, boys barely old enough to shave. They didn't look righteous. They looked scared. Dalton wasn't finished. "You defy the word of God." Grant raised his voice just enough to be heard. "No, I defy you. There's a difference." A beat of silence. Then the first shot cracked through the night. It didn't come from us. The window beside me shattered. I ducked as glass sprayed like ice. A second later, I was up again, rifle in hand, breath tight, pulse hammering. "East side," Jenkins's voice rang out from the ridge. Beatrice shoved open the front door and yelled, "They're flanking the barn." The ranch erupted into movement. I ran to the upstairs window and took position just as we'd rehearsed. From here, I could see the open yard, the ridge beyond it, and the line of fire stretching across our fences. I didn't hesitate. The first shot I fired missed, the kick rattling my shoulder, but I adjusted. The second, God help me, found its mark. A rider screamed, tumbled from his saddle, and didn't get up. My hands were shaking. My body was ice and fire all at once. "Keep going," Beatrice shouted from below, already firing from the main floor window with terrifying precision. Gunfire echoed, bouncing off the hills, flashes of light illuminating darkened faces and racing hooves. The air stank of smoke and powder. Horses screamed. I saw one go down in a tangle of legs and reins. And then, through the chaos, I spotted him. Simon Dalton. He was circling toward the barn, cutting through the chaos with the rope already uncoiled in his hands. That rope, I realized with a sickening jolt, wasn't meant for a fence post. It was meant for me. My blood turned cold. I didn't think. I acted. I left the window, bolted down the stairs, threw open the front door just in time to see him dismount and head for the porch like a vulture. I raised the rifle, hands steady despite the screaming in my head. He saw me. "Eliza," he sneered. "Time to come home." I pulled the trigger. The shot caught him in the leg. He went down screaming, clutching his thigh as blood soaked the snow beneath him. Behind me, Grant emerged from the shadows like thunder given shape. He stepped over Simon's body and fired 2 warning shots into the air. "Anyone else want to drag a woman into the night?" he roared. The line broke. Dalton's men, those who still had the strength to run, turned and fled. Only a few lingered, either too proud or too afraid to leave, but even they saw the writing on the wall. Reverend Dalton sat frozen atop his horse, jaw clenched, knuckles white on the reins. "God will judge you for this," he said. Grant raised his revolver but didn't fire. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll sleep just fine." Dalton wheeled his horse and disappeared into the darkness. Silence fell, heavy and aching. The snow was trampled and red in places. 2 ranch hands were injured. Mike Harris worst of all, a bullet lodged in his shoulder. But we were still standing. I stood beside Simon's writhing body, rifle still in hand. My breath caught in my throat. The man who had come to hang me now lay helpless at my feet. Beatrice appeared beside me. "You want to do the honors?" I looked down at him, at the rage and hatred still burning in his eyes. And I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "No, I want him to live long enough to watch everything he believes fall apart." Grant put a hand on my shoulder. "Well said." We dragged the wounded into the barn and sent for the doctor. Beatrice tended the injured while Grant gathered the ranch hands inside. Some were bloodied, others bruised, but all stood straighter than I'd ever seen them. "We didn't just protect a woman tonight," he told them. "We protected the right to be free. And that matters more than land, money, or pride." No one argued. Later that night, I found myself sitting beside the fire again. Beatrice snoring gently in her chair, Grant nursing a bruise on his arm. The house smelled of smoke and sweat and iron, and still, it felt like home. He looked at me across the flickering light. "You fought like hell." "I had help," I said softly. Then, after a moment, I added, "Do you think they'll come back?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes," I nodded. "Then next time we're even more ready." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that starts small but grows like warmth in your chest. "You're not who you were when I found you," he said. "No," I whispered. "I'm not." And I didn't want to be. The morning after the firefight, the ranch was quiet, not peaceful, but breathless, like the earth itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The snow had crusted over the bloodstains. The broken fence rails were already halfway mended by the hands who'd refused to sleep through the night. And I was different. I walked with the ache of battle in my bones, but there was something else too, something unfamiliar. Resolve. Power. I had stood on that porch with a rifle in my hands and drawn a line in the frostbitten dirt, and I hadn't flinched when Simon Dalton crossed it. I'd pulled the trigger, and I'd lived to tell about it. But now came the part I dreaded more. Telling the truth. Not with bullets, but with words. I stood in Grant's study, the curtains drawn tight against the morning glare. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather-bound books. A fire crackled low in the hearth. My torn journal pages were spread out across the desk like a shattered mirror, my past reflected back at me in fragments. Beside them sat something new, a faded newspaper clipping Grant had found wedged between pages of an old family Bible in the ranch library. He laid it down gently, like it might burn his fingers. "Take a look," he said softly. I picked it up with trembling hands. The headline read, "Pastor's Wife Dies in Tragic Fall. Black River Community in Mourning." The date was 15 years old, but the name below it made my heart sink. Rebecca Thompson. Elder Thompson's first wife. The story was brief, too brief. It claimed Rebecca had fallen down the stairs while cleaning for the Sabbath. It mentioned no foul play, no witnesses, no inquiry, just a quiet burial and a few lines of scripture. I shook my head. No one falls down a flight of stairs with bruises already on their face. "I know," Grant said, "and so did my father." I looked up. "She came to him once," he continued, "the night before she died, asked if he could help her escape. He offered to hide her, move her east. But she went back, said she needed to pack her things, said she needed to try and make peace." He swallowed hard. "They found her body 2 days later." I stood frozen. "Why didn't your father say anything?" "He did, but no one believed him, and when he got sick the following winter, Elder Thompson said it was God's punishment for interfering." I sat down slowly, as if the truth were too heavy to carry standing up. "All these years," I whispered. "All these women, Rebecca, Mary Blackwood, and now me. They buried the truth under years of scripture and silence," Grant said, voice low. "But we're digging it up." I thought of Mary, James Blackwood's first wife. She died of consumption too. And yet I remembered the bruises, the vacant stares, the way she flinched when her husband walked into a room. She wasn't the first. She wouldn't have been the last. Not if I stayed silent. I rose and went to the shelves, pulling down the rest of my journals, ones I'd stashed inside my saddlebag before I was taken. The ink was faded, the pages worn from travel, but they held everything. Every whisper, every strange look. Every time I'd seen someone turn away from a bruised woman's face. I laid them across the desk, heart thudding. "We need to write it all down," I said. "Every detail, every memory. We need to build a record that no one can deny." Grant looked at me like he was seeing me anew. "You're going to make them answer for it, aren't you?" "Not just for me," I said. "For Rebecca, for Mary, for the ones who didn't make it out." He nodded. "Then let's start." We worked for hours. Grant transcribed while I dictated. Beatrice came in with tea and blankets. then returned with sharper eyes and an old pair of spectacles, reading every word I wrote like it was gospel. That afternoon a rider arrived from town, not one of Dalton's. This one wore a star on his chest and a line of age around his eyes that spoke of years watching justice come too slow. Marshal Boyd Duncan. He stepped off his horse with a slow grace, nodded at Jenkins, and walked straight into the house without asking permission. "You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest," he said by way of greeting. "I assume you've seen the letters," Grant said. Duncan nodded. "Saw 'em, and heard the talk. There's folks in town calling you a seditionist, Grant. Others are calling you a hero. Me? I think you're just the only man with the guts to stand up to Dalton and his puppet master." "You mean Elder Thompson?" "I do." We offered him a chair, and I handed him the journal pages, the originals and the ones we'd rewritten for clarity. He read slowly, his face tightening with every paragraph. "Damn," he muttered. "I always suspected. But this is more than just abuse. This is murder, coercion, a pattern of control that runs deeper than I thought." He looked up at me, his voice softer. "You willing to testify, Miss Hartley?" "Yes. You understand what that means?" "I do." He gave a solemn nod. "Then we'll need more witnesses, more paper, more names. You got anyone else who'll speak up?" Grant and I exchanged a look. "Martha Blackwood," I said. The marshal's eyebrows lifted. "She's turned?" he asked. "Not turned," I said. "She's escaped." Grant explained how Martha, once the most vocal supporter of her brother's authority, had ridden in days earlier with a bruised face and tear-streaked cheeks. "He turned on her too," Grant said, "and now she's ready to talk." Duncan leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. That might just be enough. We handed him a ledger Martha had smuggled out, one of James Blackwood's own records. Hidden transactions, payouts, even names. "This," Duncan said, "is the kind of thing that makes federal prosecutors sit up straight." As he left, he tipped his hat to me. "Thank you for not staying quiet." "I did once," I said. "Never again." That night I went to the kitchen and baked bread with Beatrice. My hands moved automatically. Flour, water, salt. The rhythm soothed me. When the dough rose, I realized I had to. Beatrice reached over, dusting flour off my cheek. "You're becoming dangerous in the best possible way." "I feel it," I said, smiling faintly. "You think they'll stop now?" she asked. "No," I said, "not yet. But they would. Because now, the truth had a voice, and it was mine. We knew they would come again. But not with whispers this time. Not with messages nailed to gates or threats passed through shadows. This time they would come with fire and fury, with a desperation that made men reckless. It was Marshal Duncan who brought the warning, his face carved from stone as he stood in the doorway of Grant's study, mud still wet on his boots. "Thompson's gathering what's left of his loyalists," he said. "They've heard about the ledgers, the testimony. They know their time's up, so they mean to end this before the law catches up." Grant didn't blink. "How many?" 30, maybe more. Armed, coming at first light. I was standing by the hearth when the words sank in. I didn't speak. I just stared at the flames, at the dancing shadows on the wall, and listened to the silence that followed. "You still have time to run," Duncan said gently, not looking at me. "I'm not going anywhere," I replied. Grant nodded. "Neither are we." What followed was the kind of night that tightens in your chest and doesn't let go. The ranch moved like a machine with fire in its belly, ranch hands reinforcing the gates, Beatrice packing bandages, Jenkins setting up defense lines with the calm of a man who'd done it before. In the kitchen, I baked bread like it might be our last supper. It wasn't just habit. It was defiance. The scent of rising yeast and warm crust filled the air like a prayer made with hands instead of words. Grant found me elbow-deep in dough, arms dusted with flour, sleeves rolled up. He leaned against the doorframe watching me for a moment. "You should rest." "I can't." He stepped inside, brushed a loose curl from my forehead with the gentlest touch. "Eliza, if anything happens—" "Don't," I cut him off. "Say it afterward, when we've won." His hand lingered on my cheek, and for a moment, the war outside the walls disappeared. It was just us, standing in a kitchen filled with heat and hope, and something soft blooming beneath the fear. That night, Beatrice slept in a chair by the front window with a shotgun across her lap, her late husband's old Bible open in her hands. The men rotated through the watch. I stayed upstairs by the window, rifle at the ready, eyes scanning the dark ridge where the trail from the settlement cut through the hills. Just before dawn, the first rider appeared. He came slow, deliberate, leading a line of horses and men who looked like ghosts cut from frost. The sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, and in the dim pre-dawn haze, they looked like shadows come to life. At the front rode Elder Thompson. He wore a black coat buttoned high, a silver cross gleaming at his throat, and a look of grim certainty that made my skin crawl. This was a man who'd killed and called it righteousness, who'd buried women and claimed it was God's will. Grant stood waiting, hands steady at his sides, the rifle strapped across his back. "Elder Thompson," he called. "Turn back." Thompson's voice rose with false calm. "We've come for the widow, for Eliza Hartley. The law of the Lord demands justice." "Justice?" Grant spat. "You wouldn't know justice if it shot you between the eyes. Give her to us," Thompson said, "and no one else needs to get hurt." I stepped out onto the porch. Beatrice tried to stop me, but I was already there, standing tall in the morning frost, the hem of my coat brushing my boots, the rifle cold in my hands. "You're too late," I said. The men behind Thompson murmured. Some looked at me, really looked, and I could see the doubt flicker in their eyes. "You left me in the snow," I said. "You called it mercy, you called it discipline. But it was attempted murder, and now the world knows." "Silence," Thompson roared. "You will not spread your poison here." "Then shoot me," I said. "Go on, prove to them all what your justice really looks like." His hand went for his pistol, but he wasn't fast enough. The shot rang out before he even cleared the holster. One clean bullet slicing through his shoulder, spinning him off his horse and into the frozen dirt. His followers froze in place, the illusion shattered. No divine protection. No holy aura, just a bleeding man in the mud. Behind the tree line, horses galloped. Marshal Duncan rode in with a dozen deputies and a wagon of federal agents. Their badges caught the rising sun. "Elder Thompson," the marshal called. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, abuse, fraud, and attempted murder. Put down your weapons." Some of the men obeyed immediately, dropping their rifles like the spell had broken. Others ran, but no one raised a hand against the law. It was over. Just like that. I stood frozen, the rifle still in my hands, the breath in my chest heavy and ragged. Grant came to my side, his presence a balm against the last tremors in my bones. "You did it," he said. "We did it," I replied. The agents hauled Thompson to his feet. Blood soaked through his fine coat, and his face was twisted in disbelief, not from pain but from the realization that power had slipped through his fingers. As they loaded him into the wagon, he turned to me. "You've destroyed everything." I looked him in the eye. "No, you did that yourself. I just pulled off the curtain." He didn't speak again. Later, in Grant's study, the marriage license lay on the desk, blank lines waiting for our names. I ran my fingers over the paper, still stunned by the calm that followed the storm. "Are you sure?" Grant asked softly. "I've never been more sure." I looked around at the house, the ranch, the people who had become more than neighbors. They were family. I thought of Rebecca, of Mary, of every woman who'd been silenced before me, and I knew what I wanted. Not revenge, not escape, a life. Outside, the ranch stirred with new breath. No more gunfire, no more fear. Just the sound of men hammering fresh boards into fences, of laughter rising from the bunkhouse, of Beatrice scolding Jenkins for muddying her clean floors. Tomorrow, there would be rebuilding. There would be trials and headlines and testimonies. But tonight, there was stillness. There was warmth. There was Grant, watching me across the room like I was the miracle and not the survivor. He crossed to me and took my hand, fingers rough and steady. "We've got a long road ahead," he said. "I know. But we're walking it together." I nodded, pressing my forehead to his chest, breathing in the scent of smoke and pine and the faintest trace of hope. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was choosing to live. 1 year later, Thunder Hollow was no longer a place people feared. It had become something else entirely, a symbol, a story, a seed of hope planted in bloodied snow and now blooming across the valley in bursts of wildflowers. I sat on horseback at the edge of that same hollow, a soft spring breeze tugging at my shawl. In front of me, the land rippled with new life, grasses swaying, blossoms reaching for sunlight, bees dancing lazily in the air. In my arms, my daughter Grace slept against my chest, her breath warm against my collarbone, tiny fingers curled into the fabric of my dress. Beside me, Grant rode in easy silence, one hand on the reins, the other resting gently on my knee. "This is where I found you," he said, his voice low. I nodded. Where it ended and started. A few paces behind, Beatrice followed on a sturdy bay mare, her posture proud despite the years on her back. Jenkins trailed next, a wagon of seeds rattling behind him. And further up the rise, families from all over the territory began arriving, some who had fled the settlement, some who had lost loved ones, all carrying bags of wildflower seeds in their arms. Martha Blackwood was among them, her hair streaked silver now, a child balanced on her hip. The lines in her face had softened over the past year, not because she'd forgotten, but because she'd begun healing. She caught my eye and gave a small knowing nod. I returned it, my throat tightening. This wasn't a funeral, it was a planting. We dismounted and began to walk the trail down into the hollow. I moved slowly, cradling Grace, careful of the uneven ground that had nearly claimed me once. I could still see the spot where I'd collapsed that night, a patch of earth now softened by rain and dotted with budding sage and lavender. Each step I took reminded me of what we'd survived. Each bloom, a name I remembered: Rebecca, Mary, Sarah, Alma, Joanna, gone but never again voiceless. The others began scattering seeds across the land, letting them fall like tiny promises. The children laughed as they flung handfuls into the wind. Grant helped Jenkins carry the heavier sacks, while Beatrice stood over a bare patch of earth and whispered something I couldn't hear. I knelt beside a crooked pine and let Grace's hand open over the soil. The seeds fell between her fingers like stardust. "This is for them," I whispered. She stirred in her sling but didn't wake. Afterward, we gathered near the rise. The sun had climbed high, painting gold across the valley. Martha stepped forward first, clearing her throat before speaking. "This place once taught us fear," she said, "but we reclaimed it, with truth, with courage, with each other." She looked at me then, and with a woman who chose not to stay silent. The crowd was quiet. No applause, no shouts, just nods, misty eyes, and a kind of reverence I hadn't expected. Grant squeezed my hand. Marshal Duncan arrived later that day with more documents, official ones, stamped and signed by judges who now answered to justice, not manipulation. He met us in the study back at the ranch, his hat tucked under one arm, a grin breaking through his usual stoicism. "Thunder Valley Compact's been ratified," he said. 3 new towns have signed on. They're calling this the model for how frontier communities should protect the vulnerable. "Rules born from real pain," Grant murmured. "And real people," Duncan added. "People who stood their ground." He looked at me. "You started something, Mrs. Callahan." I looked down at Grace, who gurgled happily in my lap. "She'll finish it." Outside, the ranch had grown. The bunkhouse had been expanded. The schoolhouse, built with logs from the Blackwood estate, now rang with the sound of children laughing. Martha taught reading there every morning, using the same books her brother once banned. She'd painted a quote above the doorway: "Truth needs no permission." The garden behind the main house bloomed year-round now. I'd planted roses for each woman we'd lost and herbs for healing. A low stone wall encircled the space, carved with initials that would never fade. Some nights, Grant and I would sit on the porch, watching the stars come out while Grace slept in her crib inside. He'd sip coffee. I'd rest my head on his shoulder, and the quiet would settle around us, not like before when it was full of dread, but full of peace. One evening, I found a folded piece of parchment on the kitchen table. My name was written across the front in Grant's careful script. Inside it said, "When I found you in the snow, I thought I was saving a stranger. Turns out, I was meeting my future. Gee." I cried reading it. Not from grief, but because I finally understood what it meant to be whole again. Not untouched, not unchanged, but healed. The day we christened the rebuilt chapel, the one where we would later marry, I stood at the altar and read from my journal. Not scripture, not fire and brimstone. Just the truth. I read about what had been done to me, to others. I read names, I read dates, I read about survival and choice and standing tall even when your knees trembled. And when I finished, no one clapped. They stood, all of them. Even the children, even the men who had once followed Dalton but now worked beside us every day, building fence posts and teaching boys how to treat women right. In that silence, in that standing, I felt something shift in the land. A weight lifted. A future opened. I closed the journal and stepped down. Later that night, under a sky littered with stars, Grant took my hand as we danced barefoot in the barn, music drifting from a fiddle, laughter spilling through the open doors. "Do you still think about it?" he asked me, his breath brushing my ear. "I do," I said. "But now I think about what came after more." "What came after?" he echoed, twirling me gently. "Love. Justice. A daughter who would grow up knowing her mother didn't stay down. A ranch that became a refuge. A valley that once buried the broken, now blooming with memory and meaning." I leaned into him, heart full. "I survived," I whispered. "But more than that, I lived." And around us the world continued, alive, whole, unshackled. A place where no one would ever again be left to die in the snow. Thank you so much for staying with us until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means something in Eliza's journey spoke to you. And that truly matters. This isn't just a tale of survival, but a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right, even when it's terrifying, can change lives. Not just your own, but the lives of everyone around you. Eliza didn't just escape the darkness, she turned and faced it, and in doing so, she became a light for others. So let this be your takeaway. No matter how deep the snow, no matter how fierce the storm, there is always a way through, when truth, courage, and love walk beside you. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. It means the world to connect with you. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We have so many more powerful stories coming your way. Real stories about resilience, redemption, and the quiet strength that changes everything. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and never stop standing tall.